The last lecture presented a kind of compatibilist approach to the problem of determinism and moral responsibility. But this compatibilist account was very different from the kinds of compatibilist accounts we saw in lectures 7 and 8. Nonetheless, Peter Strawson, like other compatibilists, maintains that nothing would or should change if we come to think that determinism is true. At this juncture of the course, we're primarily considering prescriptive questions, that is, questions like, what should we do if we find out that determinism is true? Or, more broadly, if we find out that we don't have the kind of free will we thought we did. So, Peter Strawson's view is that the right prescription about what we should do is that we shouldn't change a thing if we come to believe determinism, and in fact, we won't change a thing, that it won't make any difference to us, and it shouldn't make any difference to us if we come to think determinism is true. The next two lectures take a less single-minded approach. Today's lecture will consider the possibility that coming to believe in determinism would in fact lead to very bad consequences. The next lecture will look at the view that coming to reject the belief in free will won't hurt us at all, and it might even help us. So today's lecture might be thought of as pessimistic, that it will be very, very bad if people come to think that they don't have free will. And the next lecture is sort of optimistic. Coming to reject the existence of free will might make things better. To get into the spirit of this enterprise, you need to take seriously the possibility, and it surely is possible, that we don't have free will. That is, approach this lecture and the next by giving in somewhat to the skeptical perspective on free will. The skeptical perspective that, well, maybe free will doesn't really exist. Maybe our ordinary notions of free will turn out not to correspond to anything in the real world. How terrible would it be if that turned out to be the case? Is there any basis to be optimistic about what would happen if we came to think there's no such thing as free will? More generally, what's the appropriate reaction to have if we come to think that there's no such thing as free will? Some philosophers and psychologists have a starkly pessimistic view about what would happen if people came to think that, in fact, there's no such thing as free will. Of course, many libertarians think that if we gave up the belief in free will, that would have really bad consequences. But libertarians tend to focus on trying to show that there's no need to worry because we do have the free will that we need. So libertarians say, yeah, it would be terrible if people came to think that they don't have free will, partly because it's false, because people do have free will. So they don't think that there's any catastrophe that we need to worry about particularly. Saul Smolanski is a philosopher who thinks that if we came to believe in free will, it would have terrible consequences, that is the real pessimistic worry that we should face. And he, unlike the libertarians, thinks that there isn't any such thing as free will. He thinks free will is a deep illusion, and that if we came to realize that, if people in general came to realize that, that would be a big problem for society. Smolanski was a student of Galen Strawson, who has come up from time to time during the course, and Smolanski found the kinds of arguments that Galen Strawson promotes to be utterly compelling. We saw one such argument represented in Lecture 10, the basic argument for the impossibility of moral responsibility. And Smolanski thinks those kinds of arguments show really conclusively that there's no such thing as free will, that the whole idea of free will is just out of touch or out of reach. There's no way we can have free will. And Smolanski, picks up the ball at that point and focuses his attention on the question, well, what would follow if people came to think that we don't have free will? And he maintains that it will have a number of really bad consequences. I like to think of him as sort of a catastrophe theorist, that if people find out we don't have free will, it will be catastrophe, it will be terrible. Now, one preliminary reminder here. As we've seen from time to time, virtually all theorists who reject free will still think that beliefs and wishes and decisions make a difference to what we do, that what we think matters to what we decide. So determinists think that what you think has a causal impact on what decisions you actually make. So it's perfectly consistent for someone like Smolanski to say there's no such thing as free will, but if people come to believe that, it will make a difference to their behavior. If they come to think that free will doesn't exist, it will have significant effects on the way they act, the kinds of decisions that they make. One of the things that he worries about, and I'll go through several, but one of the things he's worried about is the idea of moral innocence. That's a really important element of our moral lives, that we think that only people who are guilty deserve to be punished. And Smolansky worries that if people stop believing in free will, that will undercut our respect for this distinction between guilt and innocence. That is, people might think that, well, if we don't have free will, then it's wrong to preserve the distinction. It's wrong to pay any attention whatsoever to the idea that guilt versus innocence is a distinction that maps onto the world. But Smolansky thinks that it would really be very bad if we give up on that distinction, if we abandon the idea that the guilty, in some sense, are morally different from the innocent. A second area that Smolansky worries about, an area that he thinks will be a problem if people reject free will, is that he thinks it might lead people to make excuses for their actions, and they might stop taking responsibility for their actions. And he thinks this could really change their behavior for the worse. We've seen in an earlier lecture that the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre defended libertarian free will. So he thinks people have libertarian free will. But he was really concerned that people would make excuses for their behavior by denying free will and responsibility. So they would say, we don't have free will, we're not responsible. And that is supposed to somehow excuse bad behavior or immoral behavior. And Sartre called this bad faith. So if you say, I couldn't help it because I was determined, that's to exhibit bad faith. That's to somehow try to excuse your actions. And Sartre was really concerned that this would lead to bad outcomes. Now, Sartre, of course, believed in free will. Smolansky doesn't. But he thinks that if people stop believing in free will, then they too will kind of exhibit this sort of bad faith. They'll develop a general tendency to excuse their actions and fail to take responsibility. They'll be more likely to say, well, I know what I did was really bad, but it's not my fault because I'm just a tool of nature being carried along in its inevitable progression. And there's a sense in which that's not an accurate description of what's really going on if you think that, well, how you think about the world affects your behavior, and knowing that you don't have free will shouldn't make you stop taking responsibility for your actions in some sense. This is Smolansky's view, that there's still a sense in which you can take charge of your life and think of yourself as responsible. If you stop thinking of yourself that way, it can be really bad for yourself and for society. Now, relatedly, he thinks that if people come to think that they don't have free will, they will lose their sense of guilt, that they will put themselves in a position where they can say, well, there's no reason to feel guilty for my bad behavior. It was inevitable that I would do that anyway. And this would undercut the kind of guilt that Smolansky thinks might be really important for people to behave appropriately. Now, I know some people might say, if only guilt were that easy to get rid of, the idea you could think about a little philosophy and you could get rid of all the guilt that has been indoctrinated in you. But Smolansky could say, well, what people might do is the following sort of thing, that they may really have these natural guilt feelings that arise inevitably when they do something bad, but then they may remind themselves, they may say to themselves, well, but I don't have free will, so I couldn't have done anything differently, and then try to beat back my guilt feelings. And that's where Smolansky thinks that we need to worry, because if guilt is really important for regulating our behavior, for getting us to behave in moral ways, then giving up on the idea of free will might disrupt good behavior here as well. So the idea is that guilt in fact motivates people to behave well. And if people start saying, I don't have free will, therefore I shouldn't feel guilty, that might have really bad consequences for whether they behave morally at all. In addition, Smolansky thinks that if we give up on free will, or if people give up on free will, then that might even threaten their very sense of the meaning of life. Because our sense of self-worth is often tied up with the idea of being a good person. But if I'm only a good person because of my genes and my upbringing, then it seems like I don't get any credit for being a good person. And that would sap a lot of what sustains my moral self-respect. So if I give up on the idea of free will, then I might come to think that my moral self-respect is based on the illusion that I freely choose to do good things. I freely choose to be a good person. If I come to think that I don't have free will, I could think, well, then this whole idea that I'm a good person because I chose to be a good person, that could be completely undercut. And he thinks that that could be really damaging to people's sense of moral self-worth. In addition, the kinds of achievements that we think that we make in our lives, you could think, well, if I don't have free will, I don't really get any credit for those achievements. If everything is determined, all of that can seem like it's just pointless to try to say I get the credit for it. So it seemed to me like I should get credit for my hard work in college and graduate school and the hard work I put into teaching and research. But if I come to think that I don't have free will, that this hard work was just an inevitable consequence, say, of my genes and my upbringing, then it might quickly come to seem like all that hard work is something that I can't take credit for. It was inevitable that I would work so hard, so I don't get any of the credit for that hard work or the product of that hard work. And this, Smolansky thinks, all adds up. All of these different considerations add up to a really frightening prospect. Smolansky puts it by saying that he worries that if people come to realize that they don't have free will, they might, quote, think they might succumb to an unprincipled nihilism. That is, he says, they might lose their sense of value altogether. He takes this very seriously. His book begins with an author's note suggesting that you shouldn't read the book if you're especially sensitive or prone to depression. So he doesn't think that this is just a sort of abstract philosophical worry. He's really concerned about what will happen in the real world if people think they don't have free will. So that's his diagnosis. If people come to think they don't have free will, it would lead probably to moral and social disaster. Well, so what does he think we should do? What's his prescription? His prescription is that we shouldn't tell people that they don't have free will. Again, he's a free will skeptic. He thinks that philosophers have given compelling arguments showing that there's no such thing as free will. But he also thinks that we shouldn't go around telling people about this. I suppose that he wouldn't be happy with me giving this lecture, now that I think about it. It's kind of a funny thing. Smolansky's philosophy is the sort of thing that he wouldn't want to get famous for. He calls his view, his prescription, illusionism. And illusionism is the view that illusion, he says, often has a large and positive role to play in the free will debate. The view has a few different elements that are worth laying out. So first, he thinks that we typically already operate under the illusion of free will. That is, he thinks people are already under this illusion that they have free will, that this has a really powerful grip on us. So he's not saying that we will introduce some new illusion to people. He's not saying, oh, let's create an illusion in people that there's such a thing as free will. He says, no, this is already in place. In addition, he thinks that if we lack free will, that doesn't mean that there's no important difference between the guilty and the innocent. He thinks that there are philosophical reasons why it's still important to recognize this difference between guilt and innocence. But he thinks that it requires kind of subtle, sophisticated, abstract arguments to show why you need this distinction. And that doesn't have the kind of immediacy of the common notions. But we want our society to proceed in a way in which the distinction between guilt and innocence is almost instinctive, something that's not arrived at by sophisticated argument. If people come to think that there's no free will, then they might lose their instinctive sense of guilt and innocence. So if we want it to be instinctive, Smolansky says, quote, the worst thing one could do would be to point out that ultimately none of this makes sense because the guilty are ultimately no more guilty than others. Similarly, he says, if we lack free will, that doesn't mean, as a matter of fact, that doesn't mean that morality is a fiction. But the reasons are subtle and complicated, and we want people to rely on a more basic sense of morality. Moreover, part of what's crucial about retaining our civilized moral order might depend on this incoherent idea of free will, he says. So, illusionism is crucial, he says, because, quote, we cannot live adequately with a complete awareness of the deep significance of the absence of libertarian free will. We have to face the fact that there are basic beliefs that morally ought not to be abandoned, even though they might be partly based on incoherent conceptions. In particular, they might depend on this incoherent idea of free will. As a result, Smolansky claims that we'll be better off if we don't spread the word about the fact that there's no free will. It's better to let people live under the illusion. And the last quote from him I want to give is he says, "Humanity is fortunately deceived on the free will issue, and this seems to be a condition of civilized morality and personal value." There is an important precedent for this kind of view. Some philosophers have suggested that the right moral theory is utilitarianism, as we've seen a couple of times. This is the view that an action is right insofar as it has the best consequences for everyone. But these philosophers sometimes also hold that we shouldn't tell people that utilitarianism is the best theory, because people would behave worse if they thought utilitarianism is true. So it's best just to leave them in the dark. They're already in the dark, so we should just leave them there. And Smolansky is saying something similar about free will. Now, this all smacks of paternalism, because Smolansky is saying that we, the ones in the know, the elite, shouldn't reveal the truth to the masses because it wouldn't be good for them, or for us for that matter. But Smolansky thinks that the stakes are so high that we just shouldn't take the risk of telling people that they don't have free will. So Smolansky prescribes that we stay mum about the fact that we don't have free will. The whole key to his argument, of course, is the prediction that terrible things would follow if people came to realize that they don't have free will. In particular, he worries that people's moral attitudes and values would be deeply eroded if they gave up the idea of free will. Is he right about that? Well, the opposite perspective was suggested by David Hume in the same kind of ideas that we saw in the last lecture, and he maintains that the human sentiments that drive morality are just too powerful to be swayed by airy considerations about libertarian free will or determinism. So he writes, "The natural sentiments of the human mind are not to be controlled or altered by any philosophical theory or speculation whatsoever." So again, he's saying philosophy is not going to budge these natural moral sentiments. So who's right here? Smolansky with his pessimistic views that people will change, or Hume change for the worse, or Hume that people will pretty much be the same? Recently, there's actually been some empirical work on the matter, and there's evidence on both sides. Let's start with the evidence that seems to favor Hume's perspective. As mentioned in earlier lectures, if you give normal people survey questions, sort of questionnaires, with descriptions of deterministic and indeterministic universes, most people tend to say that our universe is most like the one in which human decision-making is not determined. But after collecting hundreds of responses, the researchers could actually go back and look at the people who claim to believe in determinism. So when we look at those subjects who think that our universe is deterministic, it turns out that they tend to say moral responsibility could still apply in a universe that's deterministic. They tended to give compatibilist responses. So they tended to, the people who think determinism is true tend to say, even in a universe where determinism is true, people are still morally responsible. And one way to interpret this is that when people actually come to believe determinism, it doesn't end up changing their moral beliefs very much. Instead, they keep their beliefs about moral responsibility and give up their belief that determinism poses a big threat for moral responsibility. A different kind of survey experiment also seems to support Hume's suggestion that philosophical reflections wouldn't really change moral attitudes. In this study, the researchers arranged two conditions. In both conditions, subjects were told that many eminent scientists believe that determinism is true. One group was told that these eminent scientists were in an alternate universe, and then they were told to assume that the scientists were right about determinism. And then finally they were asked whether people in the alternate universe were morally responsible for their actions. The people in this condition tended to say no, those people in that deterministic universe are not responsible. So effectively, when asked to assume that determinism is true in an alternate universe, people tended to say no, people wouldn't be responsible in that universe. But now let's turn to the other group of subjects. They got the same materials, except all the stuff about alternative universe was taken out. So effectively, they were told that eminent scientists on Earth believe that determinism is true. And then they were told to assume that those scientists were right. and asked whether people are still morally responsible in that case. This group of subjects tended to say yes, people are still morally responsible. So basically what seemed to happen is that when you make determinism seem like a real option, an option that's true for us, for our world, then people seem to hold on to their idea that people are still morally responsible. The philosophical reflections about determinism don't seem to impose dramatic changes on people's attitudes about moral responsibility. When you bring the issue down to earth, down to us, down to actually applying to our world, as Hume would have anticipated, the moral attitudes are just more resilient than the philosophical reflections. So this kind of evidence seems to favor Hume's view, but other recent evidence looks to favor the Smolansky side of the equation. So, in this recent experiment by psychologists Kathleen Vose and Jonathan Schooler, they tried to examine whether the rejection of free will would impact people's moral behavior. The previous studies only look at what people say, so Vose and Schooler were trying to look at what people actually do. The participants read one of two bits of text from a science book, a popular science book called The Astonishing Hypothesis that was written by the scientist Francis Crick. So one of the texts, one passage that one group read, says basically there's no such thing as free will, and it starts out as follows. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons. And then the text talks about how the brain produces decisions by unconscious computations and so forth. And then it says, so, although we appear to have free will, in fact our choices have already been predetermined for us and we cannot change that. So that's what one group of subjects got, that anti-free will text. The other group got text that was equally scientific-y, but it wasn't about free will at all. It was taken from the same book, but the section on consciousness or the chapter on consciousness from that book. After each group of subjects read this bit of text, they had to fill out a survey on free will beliefs. And the results of the survey indicated that the people who'd read the anti-free will text subsequently had less confidence that anybody has free will. Now, the key part of the experiment comes next. The participants had to complete a mental arithmetic task on the computer. These questions weren't intellectually difficult, but there were a lot of numbers involved. So here was one of the tasks that they had to do this in their head and then write down the answer. 1 plus 8 plus 18 minus 12 plus 19 minus 7 plus 17 minus 2 plus 8 minus 4 equals. That's the kind of question that they would get. This would appear on the computer screen, and then they were told that there was a computer, or before they actually saw the questions, they were told that there's a computer glitch. And as soon as the question appears, they should push the space bar so that the answer won't appear. They were told, if you don't press the space bar, the answer would show up. Then the subjects were told, nobody's going to be able to tell whether they pressed the space bar, but not pressing the space bar is cheating, they explained, and they asked them, please don't cheat on the experiment. Just, write down your answer, do the calculation yourself, make sure you press the space bar so the answer doesn't pop up. Well, what did they find? They found that the people who had read the anti-free will text, the text that said that nobody has free will, cheated more. They pressed the space bar less often. It seemed like reading a text that makes you think you don't have free will makes you more likely to cheat. Moreover, the researchers actually found a correlation between how much people believed in free will after reading the text and how much they cheated. So this experiment suggests that getting people to think that they don't have free will makes them more likely to behave immorally. And this seems to suggest that maybe there's something right about Smolansky's worry after all. Now, there are a lot of questions about this particular study. Maybe it's a pretty short-lived effect. You'd wonder, for instance, what would happen if the same participants from the study came back a week later, and let's suppose they still thought that there wasn't, or they were skeptical about free will somewhat. Would they still be more likely to cheat, or would they somehow have come to terms with the idea that there's no free will? Would they come back, what if they came back in a month, say, or a year? Would they still be more likely to cheat? Would they never, ever return to their prior level of moral activity? I'd personally be kind of surprised if that were the case, but that's just my opinion, and we'll have to wait to see what the data show. In any case, the current state of the evidence is mixed, obviously. But let's follow through and consider in a little more detail Smolansky's proposal and what we should think about it. So, suppose that people really would be less moral if they came to reject the belief in free will. Would Smolansky's prescription follow? Should we keep it a secret if we conclude that there's no such thing as free will? That is, if we come to think there's no such thing as free will, should we not tell people because we worry about the bad consequences? Well, it depends a lot on how bad people would be if they came to think we don't have free will. If it really would destroy the moral structure of society, then that seems like a considerable reason in favor of keeping people in the dark. On the other hand, if it just made people cheat more often in psychology experiments, I think that might be a consequence we could live with. Or, less glibly, if giving up the belief in free will leads to immoral behavior that's no more serious than what we find in that kind of psychology experiment, that doesn't seem so distressing. And it seems like the threat of that level of immoral behavior wouldn't constitute a sufficient reason to sort of adopt this paternalistic stance and keep people in the dark for their own good. So which side of the spectrum can we expect behavior to fall on? Should we think that people's behavior would radically diverge from morality if they gave up free will? One instructive analogy here is the historical fear that atheists would not feel beholden to morality. In centuries past, many thought that atheists would end up being really immoral because it was thought that religious beliefs are required in order for people to behave morally. But we now know that atheists don't tend to be radical amoralists. They might diverge from theists on some points of morality, but for the most part, atheists are morally outraged by the same thing as theists: rape, murder, violations of the rights of others. Atheists are no more likely to engage in these activities than theists, and they're equally likely to be appalled by those kinds of things. And that's probably because these kinds of moral attitudes run very deep in the human psyche. We might expect something similar to be true about the free will issue. But there remains a kind of worry here, and that's a worry that arises from the phenomenon that psychologists refer to as individual differences. So, even if most people wouldn't be greatly affected by giving up free will, some small portion of the population might be. People are different, and some people might have more fragile senses of morality, more fragile senses of value. And these people might be more prone to being greatly affected by coming to think that there's no free will. This seems plausible, and it means that, at least to some extent, we do need to grapple with Smolansky's question: should we tell people or not? We still need to ask ourselves whether we should spread the bad news, because it might be that spreading the bad news really would lead to terrible consequences for a certain portion of the population. In closing, I want to reflect a bit on how coming to think that there's no free will can affect one's actions. To be sure, coming to think that you don't have free will could have bad effects on how one lives. Recurring thoughts like everything's inevitable can be really disturbing and paralyzing. It's one thing to reflect on free will intellectually in the confines of a philosophical exploration. But it's quite another thing if the problem of free will starts to affect one's ability to function in everyday life. And it's quite likely that a person who routinely obsessed about free will when making ordinary decisions would make worse decisions. So I think that it's important to emphasize that nobody here, Smolansky nor anybody else, wants people to go out and change their lives in ways that would make them worse for thinking about free will. It's not supposed to do that. We don't want people's lives to be impacted for the worse by thinking of free will. So it's to be hoped that the philosophical reflections will sort of be intellectually enlightening, but in everyday life, people will quickly move beyond the philosophical reflections and just make their decisions on the basis of the normal considerations of how to live.